Let's discuss the troubleshooting of boot issues, and there's a whole lot of them that can occur. One is the unexpected shutdown, when the computer just shuts down and you really have no idea why. Now, it could be caused by software or a virus, but it could also be caused by some type of faulty hardware. There could be a power supply issue. There could be other hardware causing the issue as well, CPU, motherboard, and so on. And they could eventually cause a shutdown if, say, a CPU overheats or there's a power problem and the connection isn't solid. So again, this could be a hardware or a software problem. If you think it's a hardware problem, because this is part of the hardware section here, if you think it's a hardware problem, you want to go into the logs of the system. So for example, we could go into the BIOS of a system. Here's the BIOS of the virtualization computer I set up, and we would go to event logs and go down to view the event log and take a look in there to see if the BIOS recorded anything that might have caused that shutdown. It could be a surge, it could be a power issue, it could be something else. So you want to check the logs. You want to check your error logs or your whatever log files that you have, log entries and error messages, wherever you can get to them from. Here's another example. We have a NAS box. If this network attached storage device was to shut down, we'd want to reboot it and find out why. So I've already logged in here. And if we click on the main menu, we can go to the log center and see all the information of what's happening here. Now, normally, system logs that are stated as information, those are okay. We're looking for errors or warnings. That's what we want here. So we actually look pretty good here. I'm going to clear this log. And sometimes you may want to export these, especially if there was errors or warnings in the past. And then it puts a new log in saying that we cleared the system. So that's another example. And of course, you want to check in Windows as well. We're going to talk about Windows a lot more in other videos, but here we have the event viewer, and you can get to that from the control panel, administrative tools, and you can do it from the run prompt by typing eventvwr.exe. And then you go into the Windows logs, and especially you're looking at the system and also the application log, and possibly the security log. But you see here, we actually do have an error. So this is the kind of thing you'd want to look at and see what is going on here. And so we need to look into this and see what the actual problem is, and scroll through and see if there's any other warnings or errors. Okay, a source could not be found. That's because that image file is gone. That's okay. So you want to be able to look into all these different logs, like the event viewer in Windows, various log files within your network devices, and also the BIOS. Now, there's lots of other errors that can come about as boot issues, lots of different things, not just shutdowns. There's all kinds of things. So let's talk about a lot of those right now. We'll start with system lockups. A system lockup could be caused by a lot of different things, and a system lockup could also be known as a freeze or a computer hang. So lots of possible causes. It could be caused by memory or by the operating system. So the first thing you want to do is try rebooting the system, and then also try power cycling the entire system. And that means turning everything off completely and possibly unplugging everything, then unplugging everything back in and turning everything back on. You also want to try checking the RAM and see that it's seated properly, and make sure it's clean. Make sure the connectors are clean. And of course, you want to make sure it's the right type. Then you can try updating the operating system and updating the applications as well. So a little bit about system lockups. Next, you might get postcode beeps and any of the beep codes that you hear when the computer starts. Now, generally, with today's computers, you don't hear any beeps if everything is okay, but you can enable a successful boot beep, a single beep. But that can be confusing. So Usually, and that's because some of the beep codes out there are one beep. So usually today's computers will have no beeps if it boots successfully. But you could get beep codes, and there's all kinds of beep codes out there. For example, the AMI BIOS has a whole list of beep codes. And one example of that, one short beep is the DRAM failure. And that's actually a DRAM refresh failure. And the AMI BIOS is used by a lot of ASUS boards. Some of the ASUS boards I've used in the past in some of the videos. And we have an ASUS board in the computer we built, AV Editor. And so one short beep means that there's a DRAM refresh failure. So you want to check that RAM. You want to make sure it's the right type. Make sure you have 2 if you're doing dual channel, or 4 if you're doing quad channel. Make sure it's clean. Reseat it if necessary. And on an AMI BIOS based motherboard, or an ASUS BIOS motherboard, you might get 8 short beeps, which could be a display error. And there's a couple different types of those. There could be a CMOS error or a cache memory error, and there's various beep codes for this. And it all depends on what type of BIOS you have. You might have AMI BIOS, you might have Award BIOS, or Dell, or IBM, or Mac BIOS, or Phoenix. So it all depends on what you're running. And so you want to look up your particular motherboard on the manufacturer's website and look at the beep codes within the motherboard documentation. You can also go to third-party sites. For example, Computer Hope and a couple other places have a lot of the old school beep codes that are out there for the different BIOS. Next one is a blank screen on boot up, and in parentheses, the big 4. You always want to check the big 4 if you don't see anything on the screen. And the big 4 are the CPU, the motherboard, the RAM, and the video card, and the video in general. If you don't see anything on the screen, make sure that the computer's turned on, make sure that the monitor's turned on and plugged in, make sure that, everything is connected properly. But then beyond that, you troubleshoot the big 4. Quite often it's a video issue. The monitor's not plugged into the video card. The monitor's not turned on. It's not connected to the right port. Or the monitor's on-screen display hasn't been configured for the right type of video port. That is, if it's not automatically sensing the ports. And then in addition to that, the video card could be loose, or you might have other connectivity issues inside the computer. Maybe the video card isn't getting power. Maybe you didn't connect the 6-pin or 8-pin power connection. And then you check the other 3. Make sure the RAM is seated properly, the CPU is connected properly, the CPU fan, the CPU 4-pin or 8-pin power, the EATX 12-volt. Check the motherboard last. Make sure that that's getting main power from the power supply. Make sure all the connections are there. And always check those big 4, because that's what a blank screen, if all the connections externally on the computer are good, the blank screen can usually be broken down to the big 4, the video, the RAM, the CPU, and the motherboard. So always check those. BIOS time and settings resets. That's another one. If you see this could be caused by a variety of reasons, but generally it's battery related. If you see the time resets in your BIOS or your UEFI back to January 1st, 2000, or maybe January 1st, 2010, or, it's going to be different from one system to the next. The newer the system, the later the date. But that'll be the reset date for the BIOS. That'll happen if you, on a desktop computer, if the lithium battery has gone dead, so you'll need to replace that. Or if you, on some laptops, if you pull the battery, the main battery, the battery that you charge, that may also change the BIOS or the UEFI time and date back to a certain time, like January 1st, 2010. So always check that. And that's generally what the reason is for that. It could be that the BIOS was flashed also. You might have upgraded the firmware. So it's a couple possibilities, but always check the battery for that. Next, attempts to boot to the incorrect device. This generally will be because of one of two things. One, the boot priority in the BIOS or the UEFI has been modified, or it wasn't correct to start with. And if you can't get to the hard drive, you want to make sure hard drive is first. If you can't boot to the optical drive, you want to make sure that's first. The other possibility is there's media in one of your drives. You know, you might have the optical drive or the USB flash drive listed first in the boot priority before the hard drive. And normally the hard drive boots fine unless you have a bootable disk in the optical drive, or if you have a USB flash drive that's bootable in the USB port. So, you know, you want to check if there is removable media that is bootable, and, you know, get rid of that so you can boot to the hard drive, and consider putting the hard drive first in the boot priority in the BIOS or the UEFI. Next is continuous reboots. This is a big problem in just about any operating system, also known as reboot looping. And it could be because the hard drive needs to be repaired or Windows needs to be repaired. It could also be a hardware issue. You know, you might not have enough power for your power supply. So you can check that as well. But generally, try automated repair techniques within Windows, within the Windows recovery environment. And then hard drive checking techniques. You know, you can use your check disk and your SFC and your automated system repair techniques within Windows. You can try third-party programs like SpinRite and things like that. Now, a reboot loop could also be a symptom of malware. So you'll want to do a full scan in safe mode and then update the malware software and do another full scan and see if that is the issue. So continuous reboots could be malware, but often it's the hard drive needs to be repaired or Windows needs to be repaired. No power whatsoever. That's always a problem. Well, you got to check the main connections. Going beyond that, you can open up the system and check the main power connection from the power supply to the motherboard. And you can also check the power switch and make sure that the case connector is connected for that. Now, we're going to do an entire sub-lesson later about no power, so we'll talk about that more, but always check all those connections inside and outside. You might also see an issue where the fans spin, but there's no power to other devices. And, you know, this could be a little tough to troubleshoot. You might see that the fan is spinning on the CPU, but nothing else is getting power, or possibly the fan spins on the power supply, but nothing is getting power on the computer. Or maybe the fan is spinning on the CPU and the case fans are spinning, but your hard drive and optical drive and devices like that are not getting power. That could be because of the power connections. You want to check your main P1 24-pin power connection from the power supply to the motherboard. You want to check and make sure that your CPU has its 4-pin or 8-pin power connection. You want to check the individual rails. You might have your video card connected to one 6-pin connector on the power supply. You might have your hard drive or hard drives and optical drive connected to another port on the power supply. Maybe that cable's bad. Maybe that connection is bad. Maybe it's just loose and needs to be reconnected. So it's really a matter of checking all those connections and making sure everything is good. And again, you want to make sure that your power supply is powerful enough for all of your devices. And finally on the list here, proprietary crash screens. For Windows, you might get a blue screen of death, the BSOD. In OS X, you might get the spinning pinwheel. The blue screen of death could be due to a driver issue. It could also be due to a RAM issue. So you want to check your RAM with a mem test. You can use the Windows mem test or third-party mem tests. You can use bootable Linux software to check your memory as well. But sometimes you'll see on the blue screen a particular driver fails, such as cdfs.sys or ntfs.sys, maybe a file system driver, maybe a device driver. But usually it's more of a low-level driver that controls a lot of different things. And if that fails, the system can't really run. So it blue screens. So you might have to repair that file. An automated repair might fix it. You might also have to expand a file off of the optical disk or get the media and expand the file. And again, you want to check your RAM as well. See if it needs to be reseated. Check the CPU. Make sure all the connections are good. Then the computer is clean. And then, you might want to defrag the drive and do some drive maintenance and make sure that all your system files are running properly. Later you'll probably want to update and make sure you're running the latest updates for the operating system and possibly for the applications. But you really got to read that blue screen. Now, if it occurs once and it doesn't happen again, well, it's not that big of a deal. It's when it happens 2 or 3 times in a row, that's when you need to really check it and investigate it and make sure you fix the problem. Quite often a driver issue, and the driver either needs to be removed and reinstalled, or the file, the actual .sys file or .dll, has to be deleted and replaced, or an automated repair might fix the problem. Now, on the OS X side, the spinning pinwheel, this is kind of a variation of the hovering mouse that doesn't do anything, the non-responsive mouse in Windows, the non-responsive mouse pointer arrow. And this could appear when an application becomes unresponsive or it enters an infinite loop and it can't recover. So if you get an application freeze like that, the spinning pinwheel in OS X, you want to force quit that application. And you can force quit applications right from the Apple menu on the top left. And once you select the application you want to force close, it's similar to using the Task Manager in Windows to help with freezes in Windows. But the blue screen of death, that's a really bad one in Windows because, you can't even use the system. Spinning pinwheel in OS X, not as bad, but still could freeze the system. You may not be able to force quit, then you'd have to restart the computer and hope that doesn't happen again. But you want to mark down what was the application you were working in and say, okay, we want to check this guy. We might have to remove it and reinstall it or update it or just remove it altogether and not use it if it keeps causing the problem. So that's it for troubleshooting boot issues. Always use your troubleshooting theory, your A+ 6-step troubleshooting process when you're troubleshooting these issues. Think logically and methodically, and think about all the subsystems that are involved in any of these particular boot issues. And these are some of the common ones. It's not all of them, but some of the common ones you might see. So that's about it for this sub lesson.